I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to such an interesting conversation. I noticed that they have put 50% more panelists with 18% less time, so I suppose we have to, that means that we have to be very dense in our intervention. I will try to do so. So anthropologists have a long, complex, and ambivalent history with human rights. They started criticizing them, then ignored them, finally embraced them and studied them. During the preparation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947, the prominent anthropologist Melvin Herskovits was solicited by UNESCO for his advice. After reviewing the preliminary documents, he wrote a text which was endorsed by the American Anthropological Association and became known as the Statement on Human Rights, defining the official position of the discipline. That is, opposition to the universalization of values inherited from the West and recognition of the diversity and validity of cultures and their moralities. This strong relativist assertion, formulated in a time of tumultuous decolonization, remained for a long time the major imprint of anthropologists on the subject, although the point was perhaps missed by commentators that it was also a form of universalist claim for a right to difference, accompanied by a universalist appeal to a duty of tolerance, clearly expressed a few years later in Claude Lévi-Strauss' Race and History. A period of several decades of silence on the topic of human rights followed, the only writings in connection with the theme being along the line of the statement, that is, in the defense of people's right. Ultimately, starting in the 1990s, an engaged turn occurred in the discipline as an increasing number of anthropologists developed an activist stance, such as Nancy Shepherd-Hughes on organ trafficking or Paul Farmer on health inequalities. The role of scholars being redefined by them in terms of witnessing, denouncing, and sometimes even intervening. In parallel, human rights became a growing field of research with, among others, Sally Engel-Mary developing an international comparative view of the approach of their institutionalization, and Jane Cohen presenting a critical view of the entire enterprise. In other words, the contemporary intellectual landscape is much more diverse than it was in the past, with simultaneously promoters, detractors, and observers of human rights. Most of the discussion of the problem posed by human rights through anthropologists has concerned culture. In other words, the tension between the unity of mankind and the diversity of its expressions, which is at the heart of the discipline, but takes here a particular moral dimension. Anthropologists are cultural relativists, a position that is difficult to contest, but should they also be moral relativists? By asking us whether the notion of a common humanity may be useful or not in the pursuit of a more humane condition for people in diverse political, cultural, environmental, or economic circumstances, Martha, our moderator, seemed to take us in this direction. And in fact, that question, her question, has two sides. One is analytical. Can we combine the idea of a common humanity with the multiplicity of their circumstances, in particular cultural? And the other is normative. Can the resolution of this tension contribute to a better world? This is definitely an interesting interrogation, the universalism versus differentialism debate. But I would like to take a somewhat different path. Actually, one could say that there are two ways of critically engaging with human rights, and the same could be said, in fact, of many other topics. The first one is internal, so to speak. It considers the content of human rights, their coherence and validity, the way their universal enunciation is compatible with cultural differences, the necessity to contextualize our values about human nature, as we just heard from Anthony. The second one is external, to pursue that spatial metaphor. It considers the uses of human rights, how they are applied and manipulated, the signification they carry and the effects they produce, the intentions they reveal and the contradiction they manifest. This is the approach that I try to develop. I do not discuss human rights for what they are, but for what they do or for what one does with them. So on one side, the emphasis is on principles, on the other, on practices. Of course, both approaches are relevant and important, and in fact, they in part overlap, of course. But I believe that the latter has been much less studied than the former by philosophers, legal scholars, political theorists, and also anthropologists. More crucially, I contend that it is often the practices and their meaning, rather than the principles, that pose problems to those who are denounced for not respecting human rights. Thus, what does it mean when the nation that is the most pressing for the promotion and dissemination of a culture of human rights worldwide is also the nation where minorities are discriminated against by the police and the justice system, where a high proportion of them is disenfranchised and deprived of the possibility to vote, when prisoners are detained arbitrarily with no perspective of trial, where torture is permitted under a euphemistic designation, where asylum seekers are incarcerated for months before having access to an immigration judge, where more than 20 million individuals living on its territory have no access to basic health care, all elements that are included in and guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. More than the contestation of human rights as such, this is the sort of interrogation one gets when one works in Africa, Latin America, or more generally, the global South, as I do. But to be more precise and perhaps less critical of the country that generously hosts me, I will propose 3 short illustrations from the one of which I am a citizen and where I have conducted fieldwork in the past 10 years, France. So briefly, the first example concerns the 2005 urban riots that were provoked by the death of 2 adolescents of African origin who had entered an electric plant as they were fleeing armed officers of the dreaded anti-crime squad who were chasing them for a robbery they had not committed. The offensive statement of the Minister of the Interior dismissing the victims as delinquents despite their absence of criminal record, and the grenade fired by the police in a mosque where people had gathered for the prayer added to the tensions and triggered the extension of the disturbances to the whole country. As dozens of public buildings and thousands of private cars were burnt, most officials and commentators of these events insisted at the time on the problem posed by these children of sub-Saharan and North African families who had been raised in a different culture, developed community-based ethnic or religious ties instead of trying to integrate the nation, and rejected the so-called Republican principles of common good. In fact, interviews conducted with the youth of these disadvantaged neighborhoods and housing projects showed that their major complaint was precisely that the promise of integration made by the Republic had not been kept, and that they were treated as second-rank citizens by most institutions, the police to begin with, and that their principal claim was to be treated on an equal basis with the other members of the nation to which they belong. In this case, as in many others, the accusation of non-respecting human rights served to ignore the demands of the minorities in that regard and to obscure the inconsistency of the corresponding practices of the majority. The second example concerns the gender issues related to secularism. In France, during the 2004 public and legislative debate about the veil, the justification of the passing of a law banning the wearing of conspicuous signs of religious affiliation in the school system was officially based on the application of the principle of secularism, heralded as a democratic conquest. Yet, remarkably, such religious symbols had never been a problem when they were borne by Christians or Jews, and only became one when Muslims exhibited them. To legitimize the prohibition of the veil, the promoters of the legislation invoked human rights, declaring that it was meant to protect women despite the affirmation by most of them that they were wearing it freely. Again, such defense of women's rights was only targeted toward Muslims, and there had never been such concern regarding fundamentalist Christians or Jews. Indeed, during that period, the increasing anxiety of the so-called national identity, defined as white, Catholic, and attached to the values of the Enlightenment, led to the obsessive representation of a supposed anomaly epitomized by immigrants and their children, who were Arabs and blacks, generally Muslim, presumably rejecting women's rights. The invocation of human rights rested in these cases on double standards rather than universal principles, with the result of fueling Islamophobia, which, as you know, is rampant in Western Europe. And the final example concerns female circumcision in the context of asylum. In 2010, Mali, which was at the time considered to be one of the most democratic and peaceful countries on the African continent, it is not the case anymore, of course, became the #1 nation by far in terms of the rate of recognitions of refugees in France. 75% of the applicants were granted asylum instead of 0.1% a few years before. By contrast, this rate was only 12% for citizens of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the lives of civilians are probably the most exposed to violence worldwide, and 1% for Bangladeshis, despite the oppression of political and religious minorities. At the time, the general rate of recognition had plummeted to its lowest level at the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless People, 10 times less than 3 decades earlier. The reason for the Malian exception to this general severity resided in the recognition of a so-called social group, that's the official terminology, composed of, quote, women who fear with reason to be submitted to genital mutilation against their will, unquote, were they to return to their country, and this protection had been extended to parents who opposed traditional circumcision for their daughter and thereby invoked for themselves the risk of persecution. This extension of asylum to gender oppression was generally regarded as a political victory for feminist organizations and as a moral progress for human rights, which it was indeed. But at the same time, this generosity of the protection offered to African women, mostly Muslims, accomplished two things. Firstly, it radicalized the representation of uncivilized and non-democratic others. Genital cutting was barbarous. Africans who practiced it exhibited their backwardness. The French president declared in his 2007 Dakar speech, "The tragedy of Africa is that the African has not fully entered into history." Secondly, it valued the liberality of the West as promoter of women's rights, at the same time as it detracted attention from the dramatic decrease in the rate of recognition of asylum seekers on racial, ethnic, national, religious, or political grounds. And more broadly, from the increasing dismissive and hostile attitude of government towards immigrants. France became again the land of human rights. Not all civilizations are of equal value, the French Minister of the Interior stated in 2012, referring to the superiority of Western values over Islamic ones. In the end, this mobilization of human rights produced an ambiguous combination of disqualification of them and valuation of us. To conclude, I want to underline the importance of thinking about human rights not only in terms of what they are, but also of what they do or what is done with them. Critical reflection generally considered the first aspect rather than the second. Do not misunderstand me. I'm not underestimating the uses of human rights to liberate, emancipate, and recognize those who have been deprived of them. However, the predicament of human rights today might have to do with their variable and discretionary implementation. They're used to stigmatize certain nations and religions and disqualify certain claims and mobilizations, while asserting the superiority of the West. In other words, with the frequent application of double standards and the artificial production of a clash of civilization, much more than with human rights as such. The problem could therefore be less ethical than political, less of difference of values than of relations of power, less a rejection of the idea of humanity and the impulse of humanness than a sentiment of injustice and an experience of violence paradoxically provoked by the very way human rights are deployed. Thank you.